The searches for a new Jets head coach and general manager have been going on for quite a while, but there are signs that these searches could be concluding, perhaps as soon as Tuesday. Let's break it down today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, January 21st, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, it seems like we are reaching the end of the Jets' searches for a new head coach and general manager. In fact, it seems like there's a scenario where this could all get wrapped up today because the Jets are beginning the second round of interviews with both the head coach candidates and the general manager candidates. There's one on the schedule for each, one head coach candidate interviewing and one general manager candidate interviewing. And what's notable is that these guys have worked together in the past. So if the Jets are looking for a head coach GM combo who work well together, who have a history, who have the same vision, perhaps this is it. Perhaps it all wraps up today. The coach interviewing is Aaron Glenn. He will meet the Jets for the first time in person. He did a virtual interview a little while back. He is the first coach to get a second interview. And on the general manager side, the candidate who is interviewing is Washington Commanders assistant general manager, Lance Newmark. Now, Newmark is with the Washington Commanders now, but he spent 24 years in the Detroit Lions organization, including the last 3 with Aaron Glenn. So Lance Newmark has seen a lot during his time with Detroit. I mean, he was there during the ugly days, the Matt Millen days, the 0-16 days, through their rise with Matthew Stafford, through some mediocrity, and then was there when they went to the NFC Championship game last year, and he moved on to the Washington Commanders. And again, there are ties between these two candidates. So there's speculation. And I can't guarantee you that it'll play out this way, but I don't think the speculation is unfair that this could wrap things up. Glenn is reportedly the favorite to land the Jets job. And there's another factor in this. Glenn is scheduled to meet with the New Orleans Saints tomorrow on Wednesday. So, one of the least useful phrases that ever gets used in this situation, you'll hear it a lot today. Don't let him leave the building, as though the Jets can force somebody to stay. But you have to wonder, if this goes well, are negotiations on a contract going to start? Is this Glenn competing with other candidates, or have the Jets kind of settled on Aaron Glenn? Have the Jets kind of zeroed in on Aaron Glenn as their top choice? And if they have, is this interview just to kind of cross the T's and dot the I's, just to make sure that they view everything the same way, that things will be as good as they expect? Because if that's the case, the Jets may have competition for Glenn. If he is the guy they are focused on, then they do want to I'm not going to use the phrase, but they are probably going to want to get started on negotiating a contract before he exits. I think it's clear that Glenn would be a pretty popular choice within the fan base. And I think a lot of that goes back to his tenure with the Jets as a player. Glenn was a fantastic corner for the Jets. He was with the team from 1994. He was the first round pick in 1994, played with the team up through 2001 when they lost him to the Houston Texans in the expansion draft, now ancient history. But the Jets actually asked the Texans to take Glenn in the expansion draft. And it was not because Glenn was a bad player. It was a salary cap matter. The Jets were in a tight cap situation, and Glenn made a lot of money. So the Jets asked, so that was the end of Glenn's playing career. But he did begin his post-playing career in the NFL with the Jets because he was a scout for 2 years from 2012 to 2013. In fact, he began his scouting career when Mike Tannenbaum was the general manager. So a little tie between the people running the search and Aaron Glenn. And, of the guys who are viewed as the desirable candidates this cycle, maybe it's because he's got ties to the team as a player, but Glenn seems like the one guy who's actually kind of interested in this job. And it's difficult to say how good he's going to be because there's just a lot of unknowns. I think whenever you take a coordinator who's a first-time head coach, you never really know for sure whether he's going to be good. I mean, you can pretty much, there's enough evidence for you to come up with a positive takeaway from Glenn and a negative takeaway from Glenn. But it sounds like, all the buzz about a week ago or so, there was a lot of buzz around Brian Flores. And over the last week, it's really picked up as far as it really picked up in Aaron Glenn's direction. Now, as far as Newmark goes, if Glenn is kind of a question mark, it's really, really tough to say what Lance Newmark's going to bring to the table. Now, one of the things I like in a GM candidate is when they've worked in multiple different teams, because they get to see different ways of doing things. And I also like a candidate who's been with some good teams and see how good teams operate. But I also like a candidate who maybe has spent some time with some bad teams, because I think there's value in learning why some teams fail. I think that sometimes a GM only works with great franchises, and he gets to another team, maybe the ownership isn't great, maybe there's something going on, and they can't function in a different situation. They're used to everything being stable, everything working in order, and it becomes difficult. Well, Newmark has spent most of his career with the Lions, but as I mentioned earlier, it feels like his career has kind of spanned the gauntlet of, even though it was with the same team, he's worked with a number of different front offices in Detroit. From front office has been very successful. The current group under Brad Holmes, during the Dan Campbell era, where they've, maybe they haven't gone all the way yet, but they made the NFC Championship game last year. And while Newmark was not there this year, they built an infrastructure that could go there. And of course, with Washington, which has been a very quick turnaround, a team that was really just mired in mediocrity at best for a long time, and it's finally turned in 1 year, has completely flipped the script and changed the culture of that franchise. But he was also there in Detroit for some very lean years, notably the Matt Millen era, where the Lions were maybe the worst run team in the 21st century in the NFL. I mean, during the Matt Millen era, the Lions actually may have been run worse than the Jets are today. So you have a candidate with a lot of experience. I think that's interesting. I think one other thing that Newmark has is a background in technology. There's been a lot made of Jalen Daniels' use of virtual reality technology. I keep saying this on the show that the job of general manager in this league is changing, and there are so many new aspects of the league that are coming into play. Technology is one of them, and having a GM with a background in that could potentially be a positive thing for the Jets if they decide to go in that direction. Of course, there's always the possibility that these are just the first interviews the Jets are doing for the final candidates. It's not a guarantee that the Jets are locked in on Glenn. It's not a guarantee that they're locked in on Newmark. Now, I think the fact that both of these guys are receiving the initial second round interviews, and they have ties working with each other in the past, that could be telling. That could end up being pretty significant. But it's, you can't guarantee it. It's also possible the Jets are going to bring in other candidates after these guys, that a decision will not be made today. But it's definitely something worth watching. I mean, we're a couple weeks into this process. We know the Jets have interviewed enough candidates. I mean, the Jets have pretty much interviewed everybody under the sun except for like the top candidates. Ben Johnson didn't interview. Mike McCarthy's not interviewing. Todd Monken hasn't gotten an interview. I think Joe Brady didn't officially turn them down, but did not prioritize them. So the Jets have interviewed a lot of candidates. They've certainly cast a wide enough net to be in a position where it's time to make a decision. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one other factor in this. This might be the strongest point. This is a joke, obviously. So you probably cringe at this joke. But I've had January 21st circled on my calendar as the day the Jets will make a hire, for one simple reason, is that I'm going to be on a flight all day today. So, of course, the Jets will, as they always do, the Jets will go out of their way to make my life difficult and make a hire while I'm on a flight, so that I'll be delayed in getting my reaction up. We'll see what happens, though. But definitely an interesting day for the New York Jets, and a day which could end up being nothing, but a day where we could end up with our head coach and general manager, the next regime running the Jets. We'll keep an eye on it. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, let's just talk hypothetically. If the Jets do hire Glenn and Newmark today, or at least we start moving in that direction, there's one key question that needs to be asked, and I'll ask it as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. I love going to live events, whether it's sports, music, theater, or comedy. And one of my favorite memories this year was going to the Jets Seahawks game. It was the Sunday after Thanksgiving. I went with my dad. I mean, terrible Jets season. That was a terrible Jets loss, but I still had a lot of fun going. Well, now Game Time has made it even easier to get tickets for your favorite events with their new feature, Game Time Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I use Game Time myself. I've used it on a number of occasions. I just used it right after Thanksgiving to get tickets to a Broadway show. It's amazing. What I really like is the all-in pricing. There's no hidden fees. Sometimes you buy a ticket and it's more expensive than you initially see because there are these hidden fees. Not on Game Time. Game Time tells you exactly what you're going to pay before you pay it. And they also show you the view from your seat. They have a picture of what it's going to like from your seat, so no surprises when you arrive at your venue. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you every day. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. A big day for the Jets. At the very least, they are beginning their second round of interviews with head coaching and general manager candidates. Aaron Glenn, the first head coach candidate up. Lance Newmark, the first general manager candidate up. And it makes sense from the that they'd go together from the standpoint that Glenn and Newmark, they're a logical pairing because they've worked together. And one thing you want is you want a head coach and a general manager who know each other, who have similar philosophies, ideally who have worked together in the past. That's not a deal breaker, but it's a nice thing to have. And there's another factor that's come into play here. It was widely believed for a while that Ben Johnson was going to the Raiders, who have a general manager opening because they fired their GM Tom Telesco, if you've been following that. And because Johnson also worked with the Lions, the perception's been that Johnson was going to take Newmark with him to be the general manager with the Raiders. Well, now it sounds like Ben Johnson's going to the Chicago Bears, who do not currently have a GM opening. So that frees up Newmark if he wants to work with Aaron Glenn. And, we're making some educated guesses here. We're saying that because Glenn, it doesn't always work this way, but it just feels like it might be more than a coincidence that these two worked together for 3 years and now they're interviewing on the same day, and they're both the first candidate to interview for a second time with this team. If you make the second round, that shows that you're a finalist. That shows that you're very much in the mix for the job. So we'll see what happens. But let's say hypothetically these guys get hired today, or even if not today, let's say the Jets go through a rigorous process. Let's say it's next week that the Jets make an offer to Aaron Glenn and to Lance Newmark. I think there are questions. It's a fair question to ask. How's this going to work? Now, again, I think we're presuming they want to work together. So there's not going to be a situation like Mike Maccagnan and Todd Bowles where the Jets in 2015 had this. It was 10 years ago, and they did the same thing. They fired their head coach Rex Ryan and their general manager John Idzik, and they brought in a couple former general managers, just like they did now. In that case, it was Charlie Casserly and Ron Wolf. This time, it's Mike Tannenbaum and Rick Spielman. And the Jets kind of ran parallel searches, and they ended up with Todd Bowles and they ended up with Mike Maccagnan. And it didn't really feel like Maccagnan had input on the hiring of Bowles. Now, Maccagnan was hired shortly before Bowles was, and they all went out to dinner right before it happened. But from what's come out since then, it just didn't feel like Maccagnan and Bowles really had a relationship. You've never felt like they were on the same page. And maybe the most pressing example of that came during the 2017 trade deadline when the Jets made a trade at the deadline for a corner, Rashard Robinson, and Todd Bowles didn't know anything about it. Todd Bowles was asked about it at his press conference after practice, and it was news to him right there. I thought that was very emblematic of the relationship between Maccagnan and Bowles. And it was almost as though there were these two centers of power. There was Maccagnan and Bowles, and really what happened was they both were reported to Woody Johnson, and the Johnsons kind of, as they are known to do, they kind of flexed their power. It was really kind of a dysfunctional setup. I'm interested if the Jets go in this direction, and it's Glenn and it's Newmark, who's going to be in charge? Is it going to be a case where the Jets is the case where Glenn's the favorite, and that's why Newmark's the favorite to be the GM? Because it's possible, you bring in the head coach first. Now, I think that there's this misperception in the NFL that the way every team does is you always hire the GM first, and then the GM picks the coach. That's not necessarily the way it always goes, though. Sometimes you like the coach. Sometimes you believe in the coach. You hire him, and he plays a role in choosing who the GM is. It's happened across the league in a number of cases. But one example, a lot of people think it only happens if you have an experienced head coach, but that's not the case. With the 49ers back in 2017, Kyle Shanahan was hired and John Lynch was his guy. With the Buffalo Bills, when Sean McDermott was hired, Doug Whaley was the general manager, and Whaley stayed on through that offseason, but it was kind of like viewed as that Whaley was on the way out, that he was kind of just helping them through the draft. And then McDermott, who came from Carolina, had influence in them hiring Brandon Beane, who was also from Carolina and is now Buffalo's GM. And McDermott was a first-time head coach. It's not like Shanahan was a first-time head coach. He was maybe the hottest coach of the cycle in 2017, but McDermott was not like that hot of a coaching candidate. So it just shows you don't necessarily need to be a guy who's got a big track record as a head coach in this league to be the go-to guy. The other question is Newmark in charge? It would be a case where the Jets just really like Newmark. That seems less likely just from the buzz, but it is possible. I mean, it seems like most of the buzz has been that Aaron Glenn is the Jets guy. He's the first choice right now, but it's not totally out of the realm of possibility that Newmark is the guy the Jets really like. We don't know. Maybe he really impressed them during the interviews. As I mentioned, he's been through a lot of organizations. He's been in Detroit when it's been dysfunctional. He's been part of the front office in Washington that's cleaned up the dysfunction left behind by Dan Snyder. So he certainly, I'm sure he has ideas on how to rebuild the team, and not just how to make the roster better, but how to improve the perception of the league, how to professionalize an operation. If that's the case, is Newmark in charge? Or is it more like the typical Jets move where they're interviewing these two guys and they're just assuming they'll work well together because they've worked together in the past? Is it one of those situations? And is it going to be a situation where they both report to Woody Johnson? That's what you like to avoid, because you want Woody Johnson to be less of a decider than he's been in the past. You don't want a situation where the head coach and GM can disagree and then it comes down to Woody. What you want is, I think you want one person in control. And maybe that's the head coach, maybe that's the general manager. You don't want it to be the owner, though, because that's what's happened so frequently. And I mean, as bad as Woody's been in the past, these last 2 years, it's just gotten really bad. I don't think Woody Johnson was ever a particularly good owner, but the decisions he's made the last 2 years, he's getting worse. He's gotten more erratic. So my biggest hope through this process is that it becomes clear that one person's in charge. And I'm less concerned about whether that's the GM or the head coach than a lot of people, because teams have all sorts of different models. There are models in the league where, of course, the GM is really the decider, the guy who's in control. But that's not the only way it works. It's not necessarily the quote unquote right way. Sometimes the coach can have a lot of power. Has Aaron Glenn earned that power? Well, it's all subjective. It's not really about have you earned it. It's, are you effective enough? If you're handed it, will you do an effective job? That's really what the question is. That comes down to Aaron Glenn's leadership skills. It's less about his resume and more about what he's capable of doing. So this is something to watch. And, it's something the Jets may tell us. We may hear about it through the media, but it'll also be something to watch in the weeks ahead to figure out, if the Jets end up making this happen, whether it's today or whether it's in the future. And this goes, this doesn't just go with Glenn and Newmark. I think it goes with every candidate out there. How will this work? What's the chain of command? What's the flow chart? What's the structure of the organization look like? It's something worth watching. And I'll say it. I think the less Woody Johnson, the better. The less room for Woody Johnson to step in and decide, break ties, the better off the Jets will be. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, there's one last question I have. It's for Aaron Glenn. It's a really important question. It's one of the questions that could shape his potential tenure as Jets head coach. And we'll talk about what that question is as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Prize Picks. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football action. Well, that's where Prize Picks comes in. If you love football and want a chance to win real money while watching the games, Prize Picks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With Prize Picks, you simply pick more or less on player stats like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns for a shot up to win up to 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds, and whether you're looking for a flex play to boost your payout or want to cash out quickly, Prize Picks has got you covered. And with over 10 million members and billions of winnings, it's clear people are loving this platform. And here's a special offer for Locked On NFL listeners. Download the app today and use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup at Prize Picks. Again, download the app today and use code Locked On NFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDON NFL, to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. It could be decision day for the New York Jets. Aaron Glenn in for a second interview. So is Lance Newmark. Could the Jets have their head coach and GM by the end of the day? Well, if my flight schedule is any indication, yes, because as I said earlier, jokingly knowing that I was on a flight all day, I've been preparing for this to be the day the Jets hire a head coach because Jets can never make my life convenient. But I think a lot of fans would breathe a sigh of relief if this process is finally done, because I think people are starting to get a little apprehensive. I think this process is going on. I don't think there's a huge problem with the timeline myself, but a lot of people disagree. A lot of people think the Jets need to get a move on. I still think the deadline for that's a little in the distance, but it could be over today. And if it is, and if Aaron Glenn is the new head coach, I think there's one question that will dominate the discussion in the days ahead. And I think it's the type of question that would dominate the discussion with any head coach from a defensive background or a special teams background. Who's going to be the offensive coordinator? Because that's important in today's NFL. Now, the irony in this is, like, one thing people don't realize is there is like one exception to the rule. There is like one elite team right now that's doing it through defense and special teams and playing mistake-free football. And that's the Kansas City Chiefs. And you don't think of it because you think of them having the dynamic offense from like with Reed and Mahomes. But in reality, the Chiefs are actually the team that kind of is the exception to the rule. They're the team that's playing great defense and great special teams and just getting enough out of their offense and playing mistake-free football and winning games as a result. But generally speaking, that's really hard to do in the NFL, and most teams can't do it. And in today's NFL, only Kansas City's been able to pull it off. I mean, you know, the old saying from Robert Saleh a couple of years ago when the Jets played on Sunday Night Football, the game's a race to 20. It doesn't cut it in today's NFL with the rules advocating for offense, and with teams, for the most part, the elite teams being very well-rounded. You know, you ask, is offense or defense more important? Well, both are. You got to be able to do both well, because in today's NFL, the best teams are smarter. They build their team up. So with Glenn, I think we have an idea of what the defense would look like. I think we know what he'd want to do on that side of the ball, but the offense is critical. And I'm not one who buys the idea that you need to have a head coach with an offensive background, because I think we've seen that there are good head coaches come in all shapes and sizes. It's not about being a great offensive coach. It's about understanding the importance of offense in the NFL. If you're a great defensive coach, it doesn't always work this way, but you should understand the importance of offense in this league, because you face great offenses all the time. You see the damage they can do. And we do see coaches with a defensive background who have developed good quarterbacks, who understand the need to put points up the board, who understand the need for a dynamic passing attack. There's one concern I have with Glenn. And it's kind of interesting because one of the advantages I've talked about, you know, he's with Detroit, so he's got ties to the Ben Johnson coaching tree. There's a counter to that, though. Ben Johnson sounds like he's going to Chicago. So we can probably presume he's going to take some of his offensive staff from Detroit to go to Chicago. Well, the Lions are going to need to replace Ben Johnson. So they're going to have some internal promotions, I'm sure. And they're going to be hesitant to allow coaches who are under contract to leave, because they're already going to lose some offensive coaches to the Bears. So how difficult will it be for Glenn to find a coordinator? Now, there's one secret weapon Glenn may have. It's that before he went to Detroit as their defensive coordinator, he was with the New Orleans Saints under Sean Payton. So if he can't bring someone over from Detroit, or if there's nobody on the Lions left who's qualified after, you know, Ben Johnson takes his guys to Chicago and the Lions promote from within to replace Ben Johnson, maybe he goes off the Sean Payton tree. I think we all know Sean Payton's one of the better offensive minds in the league, guy who really understands how to structure an offense, a guy who understands how to teach structuring an offense. So, you know, it's possible we see someone from the New Orleans days, somebody who's mentored under Payton, but it's a critical job. It's easy to. I do think that there are moments where maybe the coordinator gets too much credit when things go well and too much blame when they go poorly. But make no mistake about it, your offensive coordinator hire is very important. And if you hire a head coach with an offensive background, then the question is more about the defensive side of the ball. And that's the thing about being a great head coach. It's not really about which side of the ball you come from. My view is that every head coach, every really good head coach in this league, brings something to the table. And what they need to do is understand the areas where they aren't as strong and make sure that they are hiring top-notch assistants to fill in the gap there. That, to me, is one of the most critical components of being a quality head coach. I think we know what Glenn brings on the defensive side of the ball. We don't know as much what he brings on the offensive side of the ball. But I think the hope is that after spending time with Sean Payton in New Orleans, after spending time with this Detroit team with Ben Johnson as the offensive coordinator, the hope has to be that, you know, Glenn understands the significance of offense. Glenn understands what a great dynamic passing game can do for your team. So what's his philosophy going to be? That will be question number one. And again, just because he's a defensive coach doesn't mean anything. I mean, people talk about defensive coaches not being able to run an offense. I mean, look how many great quarterbacks have developed under coaches with a defensive background. I mean, does Mike Tomlin ever have a problem getting a quality offensive coordinator in Pittsburgh? Sean McDermott. Yeah, fine. He had Brian Dable, who did a good job with the Bills as offensive coordinator, that played a big role in Josh Allen's development. Went to the Giants. Well, they got Joe Brady, who's doing pretty well. And even before him, Ken Dorsey, who got fired. It's not like the offense was unproductive under Ken Dorsey. It seemed like there were some personality things going on in that locker room, but the offense played pretty effectively under Dorsey. It's not a case where I think it's one of the things that with the Jets, we've had so many defensive coaches who struggle with the offensive side of the ball that maybe we get a little tunnel vision, and maybe we think, well, no defensive head coach can do it effectively. No defensive head coach can make an effective hire on the offensive side of the ball. That's not really the case, though. But that's going to be the question for Glenn: is who's he going to get to be his offensive coordinator? It's not I think like teams look with trepidation if they say, well, if you hire a good coordinator, he's going to get poached in a few years as a head coach. You can't worry about that. You can't worry about some hypothetical a few years down the line. It's just, I mean, if you have coaches on your staff, if you're a good team, if you produce the way you want your team to, eventually you're going to lose people because teams will want to copy you. The Jets should be so lucky to be in that position because it's been a long time since people were interested in Jets coaches in a big way to become head coaches, assistant coaches getting legitimate buzz for head coaching jobs. I mean, it hasn't happened in quite a while with the New York Jets. So that's the hope. The hope is that you find, the next Ben Johnson out there. The hope is that Glenn, between his ties with Dan Campbell, with his ties with Sean Payton, there's somebody out there he knows who's going to be the next great coordinator. And Glenn hopefully brings him in, and hopefully the offense produces. I don't buy for a second that Aaron Glenn can't produce a good offense. But the question will be, who's he going to get to run it? And that's something we'll see. But something we may see as soon as today. It'll be an interesting day. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Well, with everything going on today, it's difficult to make definitive plans for tomorrow. We tentatively have a mailbag scheduled. Of course, if the Jets make a hire, either head coach or general manager, we won't be doing a mailbag. We'll push the mailbag off to later in the week. But if not, if there's no big news, we will do a mailbag tomorrow. So send in your questions in advance. Can't wait to answer them.